The wind scraped across the open platform like a cruel hand, flinging dry snow in sheets that stung the skin. Hazel Whitfield tightened her shawl around her thin shoulders, though the fabric was little more than a frayed remnant. It had once belonged to her mother, and the memory of warmth it carried was more useful now than the threadbare wool. She stood near the station wall, where the lantern sputtered in its iron frame, trying to trick her body into believing in shelter. The boards beneath her boots were damp and half-frozen, the grain of the wood rough enough to splinter through if she shifted too often. She stayed still, quiet, unseen as best she could, though she knew eyes were on her. A man spat in the snow a few feet away, his hat pulled low, his coat patched at the elbows. Two women whispered from the corner, their voices sharp and brittle, like icicles snapping. Hazel caught fragments. No family, abandoned, shouldn't linger here. She turned her face toward the tracks, though no train was due. The horizon stretched pale and empty, smoke-gray clouds pressing down on the white earth. It looked as if heaven itself had fallen and smothered the land, leaving nothing but silence and the hiss of wind. She told herself not to cry. Crying would freeze her lashes, stiffen her cheeks, and worst of all, prove them right. She was a woman cast aside, and there was no dignity left to cling to except the stubborn refusal to show weakness. Henry Pike's voice still rang in her memory, as cold and final as the snow itself. "I will not bind myself to a beggar girl. Find another roof to hide under." He had smiled when he said it, a smile as thin as paper, as if discarding her were no different than swatting away a fly. The station master shuffled past, heavy coat brushing against her arm, his glance fleeting but laced with disapproval. He muttered something about strays and charity cases. Hazel lowered her eyes, the ring of shame pressing tighter around her chest. She had come here with hope, had thought the train might bring new beginnings, but now it stood as nothing more than a reminder of where she did not belong. The sound of hooves cracked the air. They came slow, deliberate, muffled by snow, but heavy enough to still the whispers. The small crowd at the station turned their heads in unison, as if tugged by the same string. Hazel looked too, curiosity rising against her will. Out of the white haze emerged a figure astride a dark horse, tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered and bare-chested though the air was sharp enough to freeze a lung. Her first thought was that no man should live through such cold without a coat. Her second was that he looked more like a shadow made flesh than any human she had known. His long hair, bound back with leather, streamed behind him in the wind. Scars cut pale lines across the bronze of his skin. The horse beneath him moved with the restless power of something half-wild, steam rising from its nostrils. No one spoke. The whispers had dried into silence, the kind that thickens the air and makes breathing seem like trespass. The Apache dismounted with a grace that carried no hurry. His moccasins sank into the snow, his height dwarfing the men nearby. He tied the reins to the post with steady hands, as if he had done so 1,000 times, then turned toward the platform. Hazel felt the moment his eyes touched her. It was not a glance, not the fleeting look of a man sizing up a stranger. It was steady, unblinking, a gaze that settled like weight on her chest. For a moment, the station dissolved, the lantern, the whispers, even the memory of Henry Pike. There was only that gaze, dark and searching, as if he had already decided something about her, and needed no words to confirm it. He walked forward. Each step cracked the snow. The men at the corner shifted, clearing space without being asked. One of the women muttered a prayer. Hazel tried to move back against the wall, but the boards held her in place. Her throat tightened, breath trembling in and out. He stopped before her, close enough that she could see the frost clinging to his hair, close enough to smell the faint smoke of firewood clinging to his skin. He said nothing for a moment, simply studied her, as though she were not a person but a story written in lines he already knew how to read. When he spoke, his voice was low, smooth, carrying the weight of command without sharpness. "You're coming with me." The words landed heavy in the silence, so simple they shook her more than any threat might have. She shook her head before she could think, the instinct of self rising even against despair. "I don't even know you," she whispered, though her voice was nearly lost to the wind. But he did not argue. He reached past her, and took the carpetbag from where it leaned against the wall. The strap dangled from his hand like a child's toy in the grip of something unyielding. He turned then, not looking to see if she followed, and began walking back toward his horse. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered about savages stealing women. Another spat, but no one stepped forward. Hazel stood frozen, her heart battering against her ribs. She could not move, could not decide whether to shout, to run, to fall to her knees in surrender. The bag was all she had left. If she let it go, she let go of her mother's shawl, her father's Bible, the scraps of letters she had written in nights of loneliness but never sent. She let go of the small, stubborn proof that she had once belonged to someone. He slung it over his shoulder, broad back cutting a sharp line against the snow. His steps were slow enough that she could still decide. No hand forced her forward, no rope bound her wrists. But the station behind her felt colder now, more dangerous in its familiar cruelty than the unknown path he offered. The crowd leaned closer, waiting to see what she would do. If she stayed, they would never let her forget this moment. She would be the girl an Apache had chosen and she had refused. She would be a cautionary tale, a mockery, a stain whispered about in church pews. If she followed, she risked everything: body, life, soul. The horse pawed at the ground, nostrils flaring white steam. The man adjusted the reins, glancing once over his shoulder. His eyes met hers again, steady, unhurried, but carrying something she could not name. It was not lust, nor pity, nor even challenge. It was certainty, as if her place was already decided, as if she had always been meant to step off this platform and into the snow at his side. Her knees trembled. She pulled the shawl tighter, felt the fabric strain, smelled the faint scent of smoke still clinging to it after so many years. The whispers behind her grew sharper, impatient. She closed her eyes, breathed once, and stepped forward. The snow gave way beneath her boots with a sound like breaking glass. Each step toward him felt heavier, but the cold lessened. The crowd behind her faded, their judgment trailing off like voices in a dream. She stopped beside him, close enough to see the faint scar running from his collarbone to his ribs. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply lifted her up onto the horse with a motion both effortless and unyielding, as though she weighed no more than the snowflakes settling on his skin. Then he swung up behind her, the warmth of his chest pressing through the thin fabric of her dress, his arms steadying the reins. The horse lurched forward, hooves breaking through the icy crust, carrying them away from the station. Hazel did not look back. She did not need to. The silence she left behind told her everything. There would be no place for her there, not now, not ever. The horizon stretched white and endless. The snow stung her face, but the arm steady at her side did not waver. She felt both captive and saved, both trembling with fear and shivering with a strange, unfamiliar relief. She did not know his name. She did not know if he would harm her or protect her. All she knew was that she had followed, and the path ahead was no longer hers alone. The horse's stride lengthened, carrying them deeper into the storm. The world narrowed to snow, to breath, to the steady rhythm of his heart against her back. And for the first time since Henry Pike's smile had broken her, Hazel wondered if she had just stepped not into danger, but into the beginning of something she could not yet imagine. The ride through the storm swallowed all sense of time. The snow did not fall so much as sweep sideways in long, restless strokes, as though the sky itself were dragging white veils across the land. Hazel clutched at the coarse mane of the horse, her body swaying with its stride, her thin dress clinging cold against her legs. Behind her, the man's arm held steady on the reins, the warmth of his chest radiating through the thin barrier between them. She could not see more than a few feet ahead, but he rode with certainty, never faltering, as if he had memorized every tree and hollow in the land long before the snow had come. At first, Hazel thought of nothing but endurance. Her hands stiffened with cold, her jaw ached from the force of holding her teeth shut. But as the miles wore on, another thought surfaced, unbidden yet steady. She was not alone. The weight of his presence, though silent, pressed against her fear like a shield. The wind howled, but she no longer felt like a stray leaf ready to be torn free and lost. When the cabin finally appeared, it seemed less a house than a shape grown out of the wilderness itself. Logs stacked with care, smoke curling from a chimney that glowed faint orange through the storm. The horse slowed, its hooves crunching deep, and he dismounted with the same fluid ease as before. Without a word, he lifted her down, his hands firm beneath her arms but brief in their touch, as if he respected the boundary of her skin. The door creaked open under his hand, releasing a gust of heat and the faint smell of wood smoke and venison. Hazel stepped inside, blinking at the sudden glow. The room was simple, one long space with a stone hearth at the center, a table rough-hewn from pine, shelves lined with tools and dried herbs. Furs hung from the walls, both for warmth and as reminders of hunts past. On the mantel above the fire rested a carved eagle, wings outspread, its details so precise it looked ready to leap into flight. Her shivers began to ease in the warmth. He set her bag down near the fire, then busied himself with feeding the blaze, tossing in logs that snapped and spat sparks. The shadows leapt across his broad shoulders, playing over the scars that marked him. Hazel sank onto a low stool, folding her hands tightly in her lap, unsure whether she was guest or prisoner. He ladled stew from a pot that had been left to simmer, the rich scent of venison, onion, and wild herbs filling the cabin. He placed a bowl in her hands, the steam softening the bite of the air still clinging to her hair. She hesitated, then tasted, and the warmth spread through her hollow stomach until tears pricked her eyes. She turned her head so he would not see, but she felt his gaze linger for a moment before moving on. They ate in silence, the crackle of fire and the whistle of wind through the logs the only sounds. At first, the silence seemed unbearable, thick with questions she dared not ask. But slowly, as the hours passed, the quiet took on another shape, less of emptiness, more of peace. She had known men who filled space with words like stones dropped in a bucket, heavy and careless. His silence was different. It felt like a wide river she could step into without fear of being dragged under. When she set the bowl aside, he rose and brought her a blanket, heavy with the smell of smoke and cedar. She pulled it around her shoulders, the weight grounding her, and for the first time since Henry Pike's rejection, she felt the faintest echo of safety. Not belonging. No, that was still far off, but safety at least for the night. Her thoughts turned inward, memories rising unbidden. She saw Henry again, his fine coat, his lips curved in scorn as he told her she had nothing he wanted. She had offered him her loyalty, her body, her quiet devotion, but in the end it had not been enough. It was never enough when measured against coin and land. That shame had followed her, a shadow clinging closer than any coat. And now here she was, in the home of a man she did not know, a man who had not asked her name and had given no hint of his own. The wind clawed harder at the cabin walls, rattling the shutters. Hazel flinched at the sound, but the man did not. He sat cross-legged near the fire, sharpening a knife with calm precision, the rhythm steady, unbothered by the storm's fury. She studied him in the flickering glow, her gaze drawn to the long braid that fell over his shoulder, the lines of his face carved deep by weather and time, the calm in his eyes that reminded her of mountains, immovable, unyielding. At last, he spoke. His voice was quiet, almost blended with the fire. Dakota. It took her a moment to understand. Then she realized. He was giving her his name. She whispered back, Hazel, her voice trembling as though the syllables might betray her. He nodded once, as if filing it away not as a courtesy, but as something to be kept, perhaps even protected. The night wore on. She lay on a bed of furs near the hearth, the blanket pulled close, listening to the storm rage against the walls. Across the room, Dakota sat with his back to the door, as if standing guard even in stillness. She closed her eyes, but sleep came slow, broken by dreams of Henry's scorn, of townsfolk's whispers, of being turned away at every door. Each time she woke, the fire still glowed, and Dakota's silhouette sat steady against it. By morning, the storm had not broken, but softened into a curtain of drifting flakes. Hazel rose and moved about the cabin, her body restless, her hands searching for purpose. She found a shirt left torn at the sleeve, a needle and thread nearby. She mended it in silence, the motion steadying her. When Dakota saw, he only nodded, a faint flicker of acknowledgement crossing his eyes. It was not praise, not command, but recognition. That small gesture warmed her more than the fire. As the days passed, Hazel found herself weaving into the rhythm of the cabin. She fetched water from the river, her breath fogging in the air, the bucket heavy but manageable. She swept the hearth, hung herbs to dry, stitched loose seams. Dakota hunted and split wood, his movements deliberate, never wasted. They spoke little, but each act carried meaning. A bowl set before her without demand, a path cleared in the snow for her steps, her mending placed neatly on his table. Yet the world beyond did not forget. One evening, as the storm relented, a knock sounded at the door. Hazel startled, heart racing. Dakota opened it to reveal Sheriff Amos Greeley, his coat dusted with frost, his jaw set in disapproval. Behind him, Henry Pike stood with his smug smile, the kind that coiled Hazel's stomach into knots. The sheriff's eyes flicked from Hazel to Dakota. "Folks are talking," he said, voice edged with warning. "A white woman in an Apache's cabin. Don't you see the ruin that brings her?" His gaze turned to Hazel then, softer but no less sharp. "Girl, you don't know what you've stepped into. Come back to town before it's too late." Henry added his poison. "No one will take you now, Hazel. Not after this. You'll be nothing but his cast-off. Come with me and salvage what little respect you can." Her body shook with old shame, with the memory of his rejection, the sting of every whispered judgment. She looked at Dakota, expecting him to speak, to shield her with words. But he said nothing, only stood steady at the door, his silence as firm as the earth itself. And in that silence, Hazel realized the choice was hers. Her voice trembled, but she found it. "I won't go back." She looked at Henry, her chin lifting despite the tears in her eyes. "Not with you. Not with anyone who sees me as less than I am." The sheriff frowned, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her decision. He muttered a warning about consequences, then turned and trudged back into the snow, Henry trailing with curses under his breath. The door shut, the cabin once more a refuge. Hazel collapsed onto the stool, her breath ragged. She half expected Dakota to scold her, to question her defiance. But he only returned to his place by the fire, his calm unbroken. After a long moment, she whispered, "Thank you." His eyes lifted to hers, steady, unreadable, and for the first time she saw the faintest flicker of something deeper. A recognition, perhaps even respect. The storm outside gathered once more, the wind keening through the pines. Hazel pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, heart still trembling, but lighter somehow. She had chosen. She had spoken. And though fear remained, she felt a shift inside her, a small root of strength she had thought lost forever. Yet as the night deepened, shadows seemed to lengthen against the cabin walls. The fire burned bright, but Hazel could not shake the sense that this choice, her refusal to leave, had lit a torch that others would not let die so easily. She lay awake, listening to the storm, and knew the world beyond would return, louder and more dangerous than before. The storm broke days later, leaving the land hushed and glittering beneath a sky of pale silver. Hazel stepped outside with a pail, boots crunching into the snow that had drifted high against the cabin walls. Her breath rose in clouds, curling upward as though seeking escape. The river moved sluggishly beneath its glassy crust, a black current breathing under ice. She lowered the pail, listening to the faint groan of water pressing against frozen skin. Each motion reminded her of the strangeness of this new life, how quickly her hands had learned to grip a bucket handle instead of sewing needle, how her body had grown accustomed to the rhythm of chores that once seemed impossible. Inside, Dakota split wood, the sound ringing sharp in the crisp air. She glanced back toward him through the open door, watching the controlled strength in his movements, the steadiness of his form. He worked without waste, every stroke of the axe purposeful, like a man who had learned long ago that each action carried weight. She had begun to read him not through words but gestures, the way he set a bowl in front of her without speaking, or brushed snow from her shoulders after a task. Those silences had grown less frightening. They had become a language of their own. When she carried the water back, he reached to take the weight from her hands. Their fingers touched, and though his skin was rough with callus, the contact sent a strange warmth along her arm. She lowered her gaze quickly, not wanting him to see the tremor it caused. He placed the pail by the hearth and returned to his work, as though nothing had passed between them. Yet something had, something quiet but undeniable, like a seed pressing against the soil. The days lengthened into weeks. Hazel began to notice the small ways her presence altered the cabin. The mended shirt now hung whole on the peg. A strip of cloth she had hemmed lined the shelf. Even the air smelled faintly sweeter after she hung herbs to dry above the fire. The home no longer seemed only his. It had begun in some hidden way to carry her imprint too. One evening, Dakota returned from a hunt carrying a deer across his shoulders. Hazel rushed forward without thinking, helping him lower the weight to the ground. Together they skinned and prepared the meat, her hands clumsy at first, but his steady patience guiding her without words. Their closeness made her heart ache in ways she did not yet understand. The heat of the fire mingled with the brush of his arm near hers, and for once, she did not shrink from it. But the world beyond their cabin had not forgotten her. One morning, hoofbeats approached, their rhythm heavy with purpose. Hazel's chest tightened as she recognized the sheriff's broad figure atop his horse, Henry Pike riding close behind with his smug tilt of chin. Behind them trailed two other men, townsfolk who carried the stale scent of judgment like their coats. Dakota stepped outside before they could knock, his body filling the doorway, shirtless still despite the cold, his presence alone enough to halt them at the yard's edge. Hazel hovered just inside, her heart hammering as their eyes swept toward her. Sheriff Greeley's voice was gravel dragged over stone. "This has gone on long enough. Folks are saying things no decent girl should be part of." He pointed a gloved hand toward her. "You belong in town, Hazel, among your own." Henry's smirk curled like spoiled milk. "Look at her, Sheriff. Already ruined. No man will have her now. Best she comes back with me, else she'll rot in that shack until even the savage grows tired of her." Shame flared hot across Hazel's cheeks, the old shame Henry had planted deep. But Dakota did not move, did not flinch. He stood like a mountain between her and their words, his silence carrying more power than any protest. The sheriff urged his horse closer. "Girl, you can't hide forever. Come now, and maybe folk will forgive. If you stay, they'll never forget." Her breath shook. She saw the future if she returned. Years of whispers, pity in women's eyes, disdain in men's. She saw herself shrinking smaller and smaller, until nothing of her remained. She looked at Henry, at the cold delight in his expression, and something hardened inside her. Her voice came thin but steady. "I won't go." The sheriff's brows furrowed, as if her refusal carried more danger than he had expected. Henry spat into the snow. "Foolish girl. You'll regret it." Dakota's hand rested casually on the axe by the chopping block, though he never lifted it. The men hesitated, their courage fraying beneath his gaze. At last, the sheriff turned his horse with a growl. "Suit yourself, Hazel. But you'll carry this shame alone." They rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the stillness. Hazel's knees gave way, and she sank onto the step, tears freezing at the corners of her eyes. She waited for Dakota to speak, to question, to scold. But he only sat beside her, silent, his steady breath warming the frigid air. She turned to him, searching for words, but found none. So instead she laid her hand atop his, trembling, and he let it stay. That night, the firelight carved their shadows long against the walls. Hazel lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above her, listening to his slow breathing across the room. She had never felt so exposed, so judged by the world outside. And yet within these walls, she felt more seen than ever before. The contradiction gnawed at her. Days later, she found herself speaking aloud as they worked. It began with small words, thanking him for the blanket, noting the shape of clouds before another storm. He answered rarely, but when he did, his voice carried a calm weight that stilled her restless thoughts. Once, while she mended a tear in his moccasin, she murmured, "I used to think silence meant anger." He looked at her then, eyes dark but softened by firelight, and said simply, "Silence means listening." Those words lingered long after. One afternoon, Hazel ventured into the woods alone, gathering fallen branches for kindling. The quiet pressed around her, the snow heavy on branches, the air brittle as glass. She bent to lift a log, only to hear laughter, a cruel, mocking sound. Henry Pike stepped from behind a tree, another man with him. His eyes raked over her, hunger and malice thinly veiled. "Thought you'd play wife to a savage," he sneered. "You'll crawl back soon enough." Fear clutched her throat. She clutched the log to her chest like a shield. "Leave me," she whispered, though the strength in her voice surprised even her. Henry's smirk widened. "No one to protect you here." But then from the trees, Dakota emerged, bow in hand, silent as the falling snow. He did not raise the weapon, did not need to. His presence alone sent the men stumbling back, curses muttered as they fled through the drifts. Hazel's knees trembled, and she sank against the nearest tree, breath ragged. Dakota crossed to her, his gaze steady. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studied her, as if memorizing the way fear had clung to her. Then, with the gentlest motion, he took the log from her arms, easing its weight. She stared at him, tears breaking free, and whispered, "I'm not weak." His answer came soft but certain. "I know." Back in the cabin, Hazel sat by the fire, her heart pounding still. She watched him tend the flames, his profile steady in the glow. A strange calm filled her chest. For the first time, she believed those words. The days that followed carried a quiet shift. She began to laugh softly when he showed her how to trap a rabbit, her clumsiness making her cheeks burn until his faint smile eased the sting. She told him fragments of her past, her mother's shawl, her father's Bible, the rejection that had carved her hollow. He listened without interruption, without judgment, and she felt the heaviness lift, little by little. One evening, as the snow drifted light against the windows, she dared to ask, "Why did you take me?" He was silent for a long while, eyes fixed on the fire. Then he said, "Because you were already gone." She frowned, not understanding. He turned to her, gaze unwavering. "Gone from them. Gone from the world that cast you aside. I only gave you another place to stand." His words pierced her, not with pain but with clarity. She realized then that he had not stolen her. He had seen her standing alone at the station, stripped of all worth by others, and offered her what no one else had, a place where she was not measured against coin or shame. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred with tears she could not hide. She turned her face away, ashamed of her trembling. But Dakota reached, not to touch her, but to place another log gently on the fire, as though promising it would not go out. That night, she lay on the furs, staring at the ceiling beams, her heart racing with something more dangerous than fear. Hope. But hope drew shadows too. The next morning, tracks marked the snow outside the cabin, hoofprints circling, watching, before turning back toward town. Hazel saw them and knew. The world beyond had not finished with her. The fire inside might warm her now, but the storm outside was only gathering strength. The day came heavy with gray skies, the air taut with the promise of unrest. Hazel felt it before she heard it. The strange stillness of the woods, the uneasy shift of wind through the pines. By midday, the sound of hoofbeats rolled over the snow, many horses, too many, their rhythm sharp as a drumbeat of war. She stepped to the window, her breath fogging the glass, and saw them. A line of men riding hard, torches in hand though the light had not yet faded. Dakota had already risen from his place by the hearth, bow in hand, though he did not notch an arrow. His face remained calm, but Hazel could feel the tension in the air, the way his shoulders squared, the way his silence thickened with meaning. She moved closer, her hands trembling, though she tried to steady them against the table's edge. The mob halted a dozen paces from the cabin, horses stamping, their riders a rough assembly of townsfolk stirred by fear and gossip. At their head rode Sheriff Greeley, jaw locked tight, eyes shadowed beneath his brim. Beside him, Henry Pike leaned forward in his saddle, eyes glinting with triumph, his smile thin and cutting. Greeley raised a hand, his voice carrying across the snow. "Enough hiding. Send the girl out. This ends tonight." Henry's sneer followed, sharper, meant to wound. "She belongs to us, Sheriff. She's our shame to claim, not his." The men behind them shifted uneasily, their breath steaming in the bitter cold, the flames of their torches snapping in the wind. The air smelled of pitch and smoke, of anger wound too tight to be reasoned with. Hazel felt the weight of every eye. Her body wanted to collapse, to shrink back into the shadows of the cabin, but she remembered the moment she had refused Henry, the strength she had unearthed from some hidden well. She stepped forward, her heart hammering, and placed her hand on Dakota's arm. He did not look at her, but the warmth of his skin steadied her trembling. "Sheriff," she said, her voice shaking but clear. I am not held here. I am not a prisoner. Her words carried across the snow, surprising even herself. Henry laughed, cruel and sharp. Not a prisoner? Then you're worse than I thought. You've chosen ruin. Dakota stepped forward then, into the open, bare chest gleaming with frost, his height and silence cutting a line through the chaos. He said nothing, but his stillness spoke more than fury ever could. The mob shifted back a pace, some gripping their reins tighter, unease flickering in their eyes. Greeley tried again, softer but no less stern. Hazel, think. If you stay, you lose your name, your place, your future. Come now and maybe. No. Her voice cracked but did not falter. I have no place with you. Not after Henry. Not after the whispers. Here, she turned, gesturing toward Dakota, her throat tight with unshed tears. Here I am safe. The words hung in the air, trembling with truth. The men muttered among themselves, some faces hard, others uncertain. Henry's smirk faltered, replaced by something darker, more desperate. He spurred his horse forward, torch raised. You'll regret it, Hazel. We'll burn this shack and drag you out. The firelight licked at the snow, sparks hissing as they fell. The mob murmured louder, some eager, some afraid. The storm that had been brewing within their hearts now threatened to spill into violence. Dakota moved then, stepping into the snow, arms spread wide, empty of weapon yet filled with unshakable strength. His voice rang deep, a sound rare and resonant. You will not touch her. The words struck like iron. Silence followed, heavy, broken only by the restless snort of horses. Hazel stepped beside him, her body small against his, but her voice rose again, trembling with courage. He did not take me. I chose this. The admission cut through the night. The mob faltered, the flames of their torches wavering in the wind. Some lowered their eyes, shamed by her defiance. Others scowled, but their anger thinned. The storm of men was breaking against the rock of her words. Sheriff Greeley shifted in his saddle, his face drawn with conflict. He looked from Hazel to Dakota, then back at the crowd that swelled behind him. At last, he exhaled, long and weary. Go home, he ordered, voice rough. This is no fight worth dying for. Henry shouted protest, but the sheriff's glare silenced him. One by one, the men turned their horses, the torches sputtering as snow whipped them into smoke. They rode off, their mutters fading into the trees, until only Henry lingered, his face twisted with hate. He leaned close in his saddle, hissing toward Hazel. You'll be nothing. Less than nothing. Hazel met his gaze, the cold air burning in her lungs, and whispered back, Better nothing than yours. Henry's face darkened, but with no men left to follow, he wheeled his horse and vanished into the snow. The night quieted, the only sound the wind rushing over the cabin roof. Hazel's body sagged, the weight of what had just passed pressing down on her. Her knees trembled, and she would have fallen had Dakota not steadied her with one strong hand. His touch was brief, careful, as though he feared to claim more than she offered. They returned inside, the fire still glowing, the cabin a refuge once more. Hazel sank onto the stool, her hands covering her face. She expected fear to rise again, the kind that gnawed at her whenever she was left too long with her own thoughts. But instead, she felt something different, an odd, trembling relief. Dakota crouched before the hearth, feeding the flames, his profile cast in shifting light. Hazel watched him, her chest aching with words she did not yet know how to speak. At last, she whispered, I'm not afraid anymore. He turned, eyes steady, unreadable. Slowly, he lifted his hand and placed it lightly against her chest, over the frantic beat of her heart. The gesture was not possession, nor comfort, but something deeper. A recognition that her courage was her own, and that he had simply stood beside it. Her breath caught, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. She covered his hand with hers, pressing it closer, as though anchoring herself to the truth that had been born in the fire and the snow. For a long moment they stayed like that, no words passing, only the quiet communion of two souls who had found in each other what the world had refused them: dignity, safety, and the fragile seed of belonging. The wind howled outside, battering against the cabin walls, but inside, the silence swelled with warmth. Hazel leaned closer, her forehead brushing his, her eyes closing as if to shield the tenderness from the harshness of the world. And yet, even in that fragile moment, she knew the storm was not finished. The mob had been sent away, but hatred left footprints that did not vanish so easily. Tonight they had stood, side by side, unbroken. Tomorrow might bring darker tests. She drew in a shaky breath, whispering into the space between them, "I don't know what comes next." Takota's reply was simple, steady, carrying the weight of promise. "Whatever comes, we meet it together." The fire cracked, sparks leaping upward, their shadows stretching across the walls like wings readying to fly. Hazel closed her eyes, her hands still pressed over his, and let the truth settle into her bones. She had stepped into the storm, but she had not stepped alone.